This is Duke University.
Hey everybody, I'll get us started here so we have a good amount of time. I'm so pleased to welcome everyone here. My name is Robin Kirk. I'm the co-director of the Duke Human Rights Center at the Franklin Humanities Institute, and also one of the leaders of a Basque Connections project on how to construct memory at Duke University and in Durham, in our own city. This is the first of 3 talks in a series called Dangerous Memories, and it explores how universities are coming to terms with complex, sometimes dangerous, stories of the past. Increasingly, especially private universities, are examining how institutions dedicated to higher learning came to be, often in circumstances that rested on immense human suffering. Just to name a few that have been in the news lately, to stay solvent, Georgetown University sold 272 slaves in 1838 and is now engaged in a community-wide effort to atone for the past. That's their words, including offering a formal apology, creating an institute for the study of slavery, and erecting a public memorial to the slaves whose labor benefited the institution. Columbia University recently premiered a website looking at how slavery was intertwined with the life of the college. But before all of that came Brown University. Beautifully written, thickly documented, persuasively argued, the report that Dr. Brenda Allen helped create is a milestone in what I consider national efforts to uphold the universal right to truth. Here at Duke, I was inspired by this report to work with students, many of whom are here, I'm happy to say, to look at our own debt to the economies of slavery and segregation, as well as our university's long legacy of activism and protest on campus. Next year, we plan to release a report calling on our leaders to sponsor a deep dive on this history and also fund new memorials in the spirit of the plaque to architect Julian Abel as a way of recognizing what Durham native Polly Murray would call both the degradation and the dignity of our ancestors. So I'm very pleased to welcome Brenda Allen to Duke. She is Winston-Salem State University's Provost and Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs. Prior to taking her position at WSSU, Dr. Allen served as Associate Provost and Director of Institutional Diversity at Brown. She was a member of the Brown Steering Committee on Slavery and Justice that was named in 2003 by then President Ruth J. Simmons. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Allen to Duke. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation. President Simmons sent me an email one morning a couple of weeks ago and said she had been invited and she wouldn't be able to make it, and she would suggest that I come if they call me. And so, you know, I'm how many years away from her and I still can't say no. I was like, sure. So sure enough, Robin emailed me that very day. And so I'm really happy to be here, and I'm happy to share our story. I have to say I've been away from Brown since July of 2009. The committee issued this report in October or September of 2006. And so with the request to come and talk about the project, I had to do a lot of remembering, right? So I just went back to my files and on my computer and just started to look at some of the memos and minutes and things that I had to write in reference to just the committee. And slowly but surely, those memories come back. Many of them good, some of them a little still tends to shake me, but I will always say that my experience on that steering committee actually is one of the highlights of my life, not just as an academic, but as a person. I think I grew in my administrative experiences and skills probably 100-fold trying to manage that kind of diversity on a committee. But more than that, as a person, I think I grew, and especially as an African American, I came to understand so many things about how the past actually intersects with the future, and how much of my own life and my life chances and opportunities were also bound up in this story as well. And so it is a very, I think, intellectually, could be a very intellectually and personally satisfying experience if you all find yourself going down this road. But at the same time, my first word of advice is that you have to manage those passions, because these are stories that are deeply human. And human beings have a lot of different takes and perspectives on it. And as we try to come to grips with those ideas as a community, we come to understand the great diversity in those thoughts. And so I want to just sort of go through our story. I have some PowerPoint slides here that are just designed to help me manage my conversation. I hope that you all will interrupt at any time. I don't have a lot of slides. It's a process. Some stories I can share at different points. But more than that, I'm interested in what some of your thoughts are. Maybe there's some anxieties. Maybe there's some questions you have about how do you really get this started. So at any point, if something hits you, just break in and we can talk about that. So I've sort of broken this down into the public story. The story you can go on a nice, beautiful website. It's still a beautiful website. It has lots of information on there. And then there's a real private process. And I think for anyone, it's the private process that needs the greatest amount of thought. And I think it's the thing that any institution coming after Brown who endeavors to do a project like this can really learn more from that private process than they actually can on that nice, beautiful website. So I have, the nice banner and the cover of the actual thing, but in the middle, that's really what it was about. Having someone try to bring lots of sides of a conversation together. So I want to just offer a little bit about that. So just to begin with the impetus for it, and I was reminded as I was leaving campus by my dean, who actually also spent some time with me at Brown University, that the conversation about reparations, at least in terms of things documented on campus, goes back to as early as 1968, when Horace Mann Bond, who was a graduate actually of the university I attended, Lincoln University, gave a lecture to faculty and talked about it being necessary for them as a faculty to engage their past and to try to understand how that past was affecting how they were operating in that current state in 1968. 68 is, the height of the civil rights movement, lots of things going on in the country. We're thinking about affirmative action and opening up access. And so really it was Horace Mann Bond that talked a lot about who talked first at Brown, at least on record, about the need to revisit the past. But in actuality, as a nation, we know that in 2000, Randall Robinson, who was then the, executive director of transatlantic, I'm forgetting, but anyway, he published this little small book. It's called The Debt: What America Owes Blacks, Reigniting the Reparations Debate. Interesting point they just told me about Randall Robinson is that he is an alum of Virginia Union, another historically black college. And so having come out of the historically black college background and just really sort of looking at the world and the nation, this book, The Debt, if you haven't read it, it's just fascinating, because it's just a story that just sort of weaves together things that happen in this country and how they all kind of come together to give some meaning to the current state of race relations in the U.S. Nonetheless, the book gets published, and then all of a sudden we're starting to talk about reparations as a nation again. So it's not the first time that the topic has come up, but he definitely reignited it. About a year or so later, and this is before President Simmons actually got to Brown, the Brown Daily Herald, the student newspaper, published a paid advertisement from David Horowitz. The advertisement was called 10 Reasons Reparations for Slavery is a Bad Idea and Racist Too. And it had, 10 sort of points that were very offensive for many people. Students stole the paper, And then that just caused all kind of stuff happening on campus. At that point, Ruth had been named president of Brown University, but she had not yet taken on her tenure there yet. And so I remember being there in the office with her at Smith towards the time she was leaving and getting all these calls because people are trying to ask her, well, what do you think about that? So before she even gets to the campus, it's this whole uproar around race again, also around this idea of reparations. As she was named president, so much was made in the press of her rise from being the youngest of 13 kids in a sharecropping family in Texas to, you know, being this PhD person from Harvard to going to Princeton to coming to Smith to going to Brown. So the real rag to riches, you have opportunities as an African American person's story entering into a university that has found itself in sort of a racial conversation that started out not from a nice place, but from a place of tension. I think I also can add on here that in her first year as president at Brown, there was another set of incidents with the police officers at Brown and African American males on campus, which again sparked another big conversation among students and faculty and staff about race. And so her first couple of years in there, if you put 9/11 happening right after she gets there, was just sort of wrought with all these things that are happening. But then in 2002, that lawsuit was filed in New York, and it was filed against some big corporate giants, but it named directly prominent universities, and among them was Brown. So it named Yale, it named Harvard, it named Brown. And so with that context and with her in her history and her personal history being there, many people were looking to her to try to figure out, well, what are you going to do to address this question? And the one thing that I'm so proud, many things that I'm proud of President Simmons for, but she understood and the significance of the story. She also understood the complexity of the conversation. And so what she decided to do was to take the lead by initiating this inquiry at Brown. And you can't imagine what the response was on all sides of it. And so she opened it up in a very bold and courageous way. And so that then led to a committee being formed in 2003. So the committee, definitely faculty, student driven. Administrators such as myself was a part of it to actually be a part and be the glue to bring things back. But it was mostly a committee of faculty and students. It was a committee that was charged by the president. So it came from the top, and the charge was really very clear. Although people were talking about reparations in particular, what President Simmons understood was that these were questions that were intellectual. These were questions about history. They were questions about perspective. We weren't the first people to start talking about reparations. The whole idea of reparations is steeped in a whole bunch of other stuff. And so she wanted it to be a thoughtful inquiry. She wanted it to be about the things that the university could do the best, and that was to use its intellectual resources to really raise a rigorous conversation. Her goal was to hopefully help the campus in particular, but maybe the nation and the world, come to a deeper understanding about the complexity that's wrapped around this whole conversation that we so easily put in this label of reparations. And so if you look at our Slavery and Justice report, we talk about reparations, but we talk about reparations as only one form of restorative justice. There are so many ways, and then reparations in and of itself can manifest themselves in many different ways. And we believe that that was a great contribution to the conversation, because often it's always reduced to what the country owes people in terms of usually dollars and cents, as opposed to many of the other things. So the basic charge was to organize these events that would help to stimulate this deep, serious, and rigorous thought. It was to be a critical intellectual exploration. And so again, one of my first points is that as a university, raising these kinds of ideas and opportunities to explore things from an intellectual perspective is what we do. And I think if we couch our mission for any of these activities in the context of what universities do, then you always have the answer when people are saying, well, what are you doing this for? Well, that's what we do. At universities, we look at questions. We look at controversial things. We try to understand how the past and the present come together. And generally, that's a way in which you can always manage the sort of critiques that always try to come back to everything being about some kind of a personal interest or a bias or a vendetta. Surely we all have perspectives, but there's no place that's better suited to deal with these questions than the university. And so I think that it's the best place for it, and that's the answer when people ask why. Any questions about that? So that's the charge. And the basic programming, it took us 6 months. So Ruth, that is, named this committee in April. I get hired in June. I start July, and then August, this is like one of my first big things I have to help manage. And so I was the sort of liaison from the president's office to the steering committee. It took us 6 months just to figure out our surroundings. What were we really supposed to do? We had this letter, and this letter actually had a well-defined charge, but no one really understood what that meant. So what were public activities and opportunities? Who should we invite? When you have this whole diverse committee of people from all kinds of backgrounds and ways of thinking about it, getting to a list of people was really hard. Getting to the big constructs that we would study was hard. So it took us 6 months. But finally by February, we got to our first round of programming, and we decided to start by focusing in on the history of slavery in New England. One of the things we had come to understand is that was the little known story, right? Every time we think about slavery, we think about the Mason-Dixon line, we think about cotton, we think about the South. And many people don't know the story of slavery in the North. Many people don't know that half of the journeys from the U.S. to Africa started in ports in Rhode Island. People did not understand how much of the economy of the United States that was built on cotton really also relied on sugar cane that we got from the Caribbean to take up to New England to make rum, to run that triangle trade thing, and that it was really not coming from the port of Virginia per se, but it was leaving right out of Bristol, Rhode Island, going down to the west coast of Africa, going over to Cuba and to Jamaica, and then coming back up and bringing the sugar back to make the rum. And that was really the triangle trade. So we started there. We had some great people who had been looking into this. Remember a great presentation, it was called The Butcher, the Baker, the Candlestick Maker, because it really talked about how pervasive this trade was in New England, that you didn't have to be someone on a ship sailing to the west coast of Africa to gather up human beings, but everything that ship needed to be outfitted to do that, everyone contributed to it. The local bakery made the bread, the codfish that they took to Jamaica to eat, the salting of it, the candles that they used to light the boat. Every bit of industry in New England was tied up in outfitting these ships in order to go. And so you start to understand that you can't just blame one person, that this is not about evil people, but it's really a story about an economy that was supported, a practice of slavery that upheld the economy in this country, and that anyone who was doing any kind of business or trade during that time had, to some degree, some level of complicity, I guess, in the actual trade. So that was really eye-opening a lot for many of us, because Northerners like to believe that we were hands-free of this, and not quite true. Another very interesting thing about what was happening in the first year that I'll talk about that slacked off in this problem is that we did a lot of public forums. So at Brown, during the commencement week, lots of parents and alumni on campus, we held these commencement forums where people come and learn about current things. But we did quite a few just talking about the committee, its work, and what it was trying to do. We engaged staff in those conversations, did presentations for them at their development day. But most important, the majority of the work that was done, that was original work from Brown, was done through faculty-student research. So we used it's called UTRA, which is a research fund, to fund student research. They were the ones in the archives. They were the ones digging through the library. They were the ones finding the information and helping to put together those presentations. And that was really very important because, again, as we talked about why it was important that we do it, it's one thing to say universities engage in this kind of intellectual inquiry, but we need to talk about engaging in that towards offering our students opportunities to engage in very meaningful experiences. And doing undergraduate research around a topic of this caliber and of this interest, I think, was a great opportunity for our students. During the 2004-2005 year, we did a lot of programming, and I'll talk a little bit about what some of those were. But again, town hall meetings, were about those. I'll talk a little bit about that. We had film screenings, you know. There were lectures, there were conferences. There was a big conference at Yale, David Blight put on. We participated in that, and again, faculty-student research. But it was towards the spring of 2004-2005 that the committee had to start thinking about, it only had one more year, and it had a year to produce a report. So we went into retreat for a day and then tried to figure out where we were. And again, I'll talk about a little bit about why in the process that was so important from a private process standpoint. During the final year, we did the final programming. That report was written and rewritten. We submitted it to the president once. She didn't like the recommendations. She said they weren't bold enough, so she gave it back. And so we had to sit again and write it some more. Finally submitted the report. It was released in the fall of 2006. The committee ended its work in the summer of 2006. The report was released in the fall of 2006. And interestingly enough, the report was released. I was in Cape Town, South Africa, on Robben Island, which is just how life has it. Learning the story of Nelson Mandela when I get this email saying this report was released at Brown, and people were looking for me to give some kind of comment, and I was just glad I wasn't there. But anyway, that's divine intervention. But at our very next corporation board meeting, they endorsed the report and the recommendations. And I just think that, you know, that's the basic timeline, but what's important about the ending was that it has such strong leadership from President Simmons starting out. Corporation was engaged in the conversation throughout. They were engaged in the conversation before she actually gave the charge. And so she had their support because there were a lot of things that were going to happen with her opening up this can of worms, and she really needed her board's support on it. So integrating them in it from the very beginning, having leadership from the top, having a committee that stuck to it, you can stick to the timeline and you can really produce a report in the end that has a lot of teeth behind it. So, any questions about that? Yes.
Did you engage with the surrounding city and community?
Mm-hmm. So that's the so every lecture was open to the Brown community and anyone else. And so one of the things I want to talk about and things to anticipate and to think about is when you do that, you never know who's sitting in front of you, so you have to be ready for everything that comes at you. But we had community people at everything, at town hall meetings, at lectures, We had people travel from Boston, New York, from Philadelphia, from other places, even in the South, to engage in some of these conversations. So this really was a national conversation that played itself out on our campus. I think in some ways in the beginning we weren't quite prepared for just how diverse that audience would be and where they would come from. But it made everything better and more insightful by having that openness at our events. Yes.
So curious about how the president got the board's support and whether there was pushback around how this might change when people see Brown, or whether that was always thought of as, you know, I really appreciate what you said about how the mission of the university is what you use to stand up, right? It makes sense. But I can also imagine that not everybody on the board thought that opening this conversation up was necessarily a good idea.
Yeah. Well, you know, President Simmons' whole focus in going to Brown was to really challenge that institution to stop resting on its laurels and really think about how you're going to be a real leader. You know, so there were a whole lot of conversations. You think you sit side to side with Harvard or Yale or Princeton. Well, look at this and look at that and look at this and look at that. Really bringing reality to people. They had done a great job as an institution. It has probably one of the best undergraduate colleges in this country for the freedom, and the curriculum is just so open and engaging. But at the same time, on a graduate school level, they have fallen behind. In terms of intellectual muscle, they have fallen behind. How do you propel yourself back on top? Well, this is one way. Be bold, be courageous, open up a can of worms and manage it intellectually. You sell that to the board. You want to be on top? Let me see you have courage enough to do this. And that's what they wanted. They wanted that school to shine at the top of the people they like to compare themselves to. That it was steeped in the fact that it talked about intellectual resources of that institution. It talked about the strength of the mind for figuring out these problems in a way that can lead a nation. It was the kind of rhetoric that they eventually bought into and supported. They supported it throughout the whole time that we were engaged in this process. We did updates for them at our quarterly corporation meetings. People gave money in support of this project in particular. So it was making Brown great. And if it can make you great because you're courageous and but it's rigorous, it's intellectual, so all that stuff we do, you know, people bought it lock, stock, and barrel. It was a good thing though. Yeah. Yes.
I was kind of curious about the commencement forums. You wanted to bring in parents or alumni or?
Right, so around commencement, all these people are around, right? Parents are there, alumni are there, visitors. And at Brown, these forums are part of commencement tradition. So people go and they might hear some new research that's going on. It's always continued learning. Parents have always been interested in it. Families, and so we put them on. So we just made these a couple of the topics during that time about this project so that parents could also be informed. And they were packed every time we gave them. So we did some specifically about the process, but as some of the data started to come through, the great story about the slave ship Sally, started to have standalone forum just on that. And so it was a way of making sure that everyone had access to what was going on. So again, if we just sort of look at some of the key resources before I sort of go into some of the private things you really might want to think about. We eventually settled on a subcommittee structure. We had one that was just about history. And those were the folk who put on the first round of of events, things that looked at the history of slavery in New England and more generally. We had a committee on the legacy of slavery. I could talk a lot about that committee. That's the committee that I was on. We had a committee that was focused in just on an institutional inventory. So that was so great to see the archivists here and the rare books. That's where all your stuff is, if you want to tell your own story. Then there were people who were experts on comparative context. You know, Holocaust scholars were there. People who were scholars on apartheid and other kind of contexts that were similar. And then there were people whose area of interest was just the reparations question more generally. So those 5 subcommittees actually came together to do their pieces. So we programmed around that, and eventually it led to the report. We also focused a lot on getting some key lecturers, and these are just some of the people, but I wanted to put it out there because there are 2 things that are important. First of all, they come from a diversity of disciplines. So we have people like John Hope Franklin, I guess your own John Hope Franklin, who is a historian who did a wonderful, wonderful lecture for us. Spencer Crew runs the Underground Railroad Museum, so just very different. Alfred Brophy is a law professor. John Edgar Whiteman is a writer, an author. Glenn Laurie, a very conservative economist. I don't know if you all remember John McWhorters. He was pretty big around that time. He's a linguist, and you know he's very critical of African Americans and African American English and so on, as we start to look at legacy stuff. So, wide range of disciplines, wide range of perspectives. You know, the last thing you want to do in a process like this is to get all like-minded people in a room, because you're not challenged. But if you can get some diversity in who visits you and the conversations that you raise, again, we tell this to our students all the time, that depth of thought is so much deeper. The creativity in terms of responses that come back are so much deeper and meaningful. And then finally, key resources. I keep saying the Brown University archives, everything was there. And so as we walked around today, the one thing we came to understand is that history is hidden in plain sight. Everything you want to know about your institution is on some plaque, in some room, on some painting, you know, in some drawer in this library somewhere. And so you got to start digging for that, because that's where your story is told. I mean, we met in this room, so it begins with a clock. It's all about meeting in this room where this clock would ding at 1 o'clock. And the clock is dedicated to the campus by Isaac Hopkins, who was the commander of the slave ship Sally that was such the failed voyage that the Brown brothers split up afterwards. But you know, here we are sitting there talking about slavery with this clock dinging in our ears. Sitting in a building, the first building on campus that was actually built by slave labor. Nowhere in that building did we note any of that, but that's the history. It was somewhere in the archives, just all around us, everywhere. What they found so interesting about the slave ship Sally was that when they went into the archives, Isaac Hopkins kept such meticulous notes. Everything, every penny he spent, his ledgers, his notes, his diaries, all there. Students just went in, discovered all that, put it together, and put together a really great exhibit that really shows what happened to that voyage. We also read lots of books. So a great thing about being on the committee is I now own all the books we ordered. But again, I'm just giving you a sort of a range. So Dr. Mellish, who wrote Disowning Slavery, writes a lot about slavery in New England, and that's her area as a historian. Truth versus Justice is a compilation, it's a edited volume, but it just really talks about different perspectives on truth versus justice. And then Paying for the Past is a book about the Holocaust. So we really looked at a lot of different contexts for thinking about what reparations could mean, how do you really think about the past, how different issues have been handled historically by different countries and so on. We also watch lots of film. So Untrained Memories, the story of the Underground Railroad. Then this Traces of the Trade, a story from the Deep North, actually grew out of one of our open forum where a young woman named Katrina Brown, not kin to the Browns of our Brown, E on the end of her Brown, but her people were the DeWolf family. They were the most notorious in the slave industry in New England. So they sailed out of Bristol, Rhode Island. Probably 60 to 70% of all the voyages from the U.S. were attributed to the DeWolfs. She showed up at one of our things and she just talked about getting interested in her family's own background. They created this not-for-profit, but they went and took their whole family back through where their family had traded, and it was sort of like at Thanksgiving and stuff. She said people would get together, but they would never talk about it. And she felt they had to talk about it because they had all these celebrations in Bristol and they were celebrating this family. She said some deep, dark secrets here. So they traveled to West Africa, and then they traveled to Cuba, which is where, or someplace in the Caribbean where they dropped off the human cargo, picked up the sugar to go back to New England to make the rum. But her family got to be at every stop, and the film is really about the reactions they had as they revisited those places. We actually did a screening of it in 2008 once it was done on our campus, and as I was reading about it again the other day, it was nominated for a couple of Sundance awards and so on. But she just showed up one day at one of our lectures and sort of opened up a whole new way for us to look at what was going on. So again, film were an important resource as well. Questions about that?
I noticed that there's only one woman in the lecture.
No, that's probably only the one woman I pulled out of the list of things I had. We had several women, trust me. I was the chief diversity officer. But as I looked at the more kind of controversial juxtapositions, it tended to be the men, but that's also understandable too. I shouldn't say that, he's taping me. But yeah, we had many panels that were, cross-gendered and so on. But these were names that, if you really look at some of the people leading in this, some of the biggest controversies, some of the biggest conflicts are between these men in these different areas of knowledge for number one, but really different perspectives, very conservative or more liberal, and it really made for some very interesting interactions. Yes?
So you said that the president named the whole, the committee, so she named each person, so there wasn't like a nominate anybody. And then did the committee decide about the subcommittees and who was going to be on what subcommittee, and how many people were on the committee?
So I'm going to go into the private part of it because that's where all the conflict is.
Yeah. All right. We're going to get to the stuff.
So anything I just showed you, you could find on the website. These are the things that we did, and some of them are good. But then there's the stuff. So I always talk about myself as moving from being an administrator to an arbitrator, because a lot of things you have to manage, and these are some of the big areas that were problematic for us. So I put down first one of President Simmons' one of her main objectives was to have a very diverse committee, a committee that was diverse in many different aspects: gender, race, disciplinary, status, if you want to think about faculty, students, administrators, and so on. And I always say it's a great concept, but it's messy. It is so messy. You get all these people in this one room with this clock dinging behind you, and it's really hard. So we had the disciplinary diversity, right? So you have economists on there, historians, we had people in the arts, we had English professors, we had, I'm a psychologist, we were from all over. So that's the first place, Africana studies, where there were philosophers, for example. Then there was racial diversity. So there were African Americans, there were Caucasians, there were international faculty on there, South Asian faculty and students, Latino, we had like the range of it. And so you get that on there, and we're talking about reparations for slavery, and it's like whew, a whole nother set of issues to deal with. And then there were expectation diversities. So students are, we need to give away the endowment, right? Reparations are good, and we need to just make sure that we do our part. And then you have people who say we shouldn't be doing anything at all. And so sort of managing that anxiety, because you can imagine in the beginning, no one really knew what this committee would come up with. And so a lot was about, still focused on just reparations, which was still sort of defined in dollar signs. And developing that into a greater concept took the 3 years of the committee to say this is not just about money, this is about a lot of other things. We also had some huge barriers initially that had to be managed, and these are things you just have to think about. But race, and who was going to be the chairperson of this committee. So this is a committee on slavery and justice and reparations, and Ruth appoints Jim Campbell, white historian. White male historian. Oh, they lost their minds. So, you have all these other people in there who feel that they deserve to be chairperson because of something else, right? Be it race, be it gender, however. And, Ruth never makes any decision. You may not know it, but Ruth never makes any decision that's not fully thought through. Jim Campbell is a great historian. His research was always in the history of slavery, connection to Africa, all the things that underlie what was important. So she chose him because he was a scholar in the area of study. And she would not choose someone to put him on there simply for superficial reasons. And so as people began to, have this little side conversation, one of the things you have to do behind the scenes is have a real firm reason for who you choose and why. Why is that person put there? If you have an answer, people won't necessarily always be satisfied, but you can shut that down because it takes you away from what it is you're there to do. And trust me, those 6 months we spent trying to get organized was really around people trying to muscle around the decisions that had already been made by President Simmons when she wrote the charge and she named the people. I can't tell you offhand. I think there were about 20 of us on the committee. At some point we had some resignations. When I looked at the names again, I think they still named everyone who was originally appointed to the committee. And then there were some of us who were ex officio to some degree, myself, the dean of the college, a few other administrators, but we were still named as part of the steering committee in the end. Other big issue was a lot of people, or not a lot of people, there was huge disagreement on whether or not contemporary race issues could be connected back to slavery. So I go sit in, and when people say, oh, they can't master, my first thing is like, what? So I'm part of the mess. So I just have to admit that. And they were like, really, you can't connect, what's happening to black people today with, what happened way back then. And I'm like, y'all on the Slavery and Justice Committee, steering committee, why don't you get that, right? So I'm following, and I have 3 or 4 more black people who feel the same way I do. So we like, yeah, right. So you got all of that going on. And it's like, but we're the Slavery and Justice Committee. Where's the justice? But the biggest issue for us was, can you define slavery as a crime against humanity? So when you have scholars who have studied the Holocaust, for example, and we understand that and we appreciate that research and we appreciate that history deeply, and we understand its meaning, to make the connection between something like that, and there are other great examples, and what has happened to black people in America. Some people just couldn't make the connection. And so they were like, really, you can't define that as it. It was a lot of conversation about, you know, whether slavery really equated to concentration camps, for example, and so on. And, you know, people on the side, yeah. And on the other side, it's like, you know, couldn't get it. But, you know, we managed that. So it did a lot of behind the scenes preparation. So the point is, somebody needs to staff this to keep it going. Yes.
Yeah, I've got to look and see who's here.
He has me on tape, so
Yeah.
I'm just...
When we were talking about creating a human rights center, we had a visitor who was wonderful from the Callister College who'd done something similar. And he gave us great advice. And the great advice was coffee and cake. Sit down and break bread with people that you disagree with. Sit down and be social. It's not all about work. It's also about the connections between people. And I wonder if you could comment on that, like just the dynamics between the individuals who are on these committees. Like how did that, was that also a process that changed over time? Did people, and why did those people resign? Did they resign for reasons related to the work of the committee or because they had other things that they needed to do?
So let me just preface all my work by, I spent 15 years at Smith College. Smith College is a woman's college. So first of all, the first thing I learned at Smith, if you wanted to move anything diversity, teas work. So we had high tea on Thursday, and it's very civilized. And so one of the first things I did there as a faculty member and then as a chief diversity officer was to get students of color in the sciences. They were my first project to really say, invite those science faculty to the black student space on campus with an invitation for tea and cookies. And don't talk about being black in the sciences or whatever. Talk about who you are, where you're from, what you're interested in. You build a relationship. And so none of that's different. To carry that forward with me as a chief diversity officer at Brown, people gotta connect at some other level. And so something you have to try to do is humanize each other and then the process. And you know, here, the big breakthrough was Katrina. I couldn't do it. But Katrina happened. So we had a whole retreat for a whole entire day. We had food, we had the best of what it puts for relationships. We had prepared for the retreat in February in such a way that we had to write down our motivations for being on the committee, and we needed to write down as individuals what we would like to see, and it still was a very tense day. And a more tense evening when we met with the president over dinner to explain it. So we went from February, and then in August, Katrina happened. So we are all at home, right? I don't know, some of the students here, I guess you all were around for Katrina. Sometimes when I say that, I'd be like, I wasn't born then. But I'm hoping you all were here in 2005. Images, image after image after image of people abandoned, right? Folk on rooftops, pushing boats, babies. And I remember coming into that room on the first steering committee meeting while all of this was going on, and the looks on people's faces were finally like, I get it. You know, they could not understand how whole neighborhoods were abandoned in this process, how the thinking for the evacuation didn't consider that people didn't have money to get out, didn't consider any of the things that you consider for poor people, people with less resources, not to mention the majority, no cars, right? Not to mention that the majority of them then are also African American. So these images changed the whole tenor of the whole committee. People then began, if we go back to those questions, you know, are contemporary race issues related to some kind of continuing narrative about slavery and black folk and racial justice and all that? Yes. Can we look at it as a crime against humanity? The real sort of breakthrough was to, you know, crimes against humanity are really about dehumanizing the people who are the victims. And so if you look at that, the only way we could abandon people like that is we somehow see them as less than the human beings that they are. And that is the quintessential meaning of a crime against humanity, the impact that that has on society. People got it. And then once they got it in August 2005, then the rest of the year went by quickly. We were able to organize that, that report. People did their part in their pieces. If you ever want to talk to anybody who is great, it is Jim Campbell. He just did a wonderful job. You say it's beautifully written. It's his voice all over it, because he took all those pieces and he weaved them all together so that it was a single voice. And so it ended up looking on the outside to be this really very beautiful thing. But it really took a whole lot of managing behind the scenes to get us to that point. And, I'm sad to say that the real burning questions really took almost a natural catastrophe to actually get people connected back. There was no way any of us could have read about or heard a lecture on or anything that could have been more powerful than the images we saw on news after Katrina at that time. So I don't wish any Katrinas on anyone, but I'm just saying something has to make this real for people in terms of what their contemporary issues are. You need to find a way to connect that really very early on.
Is that Ninth Ward yet?
Yeah, that over there, completely under. So, some issues to anticipate. You got to manage the discontent early on. So like I said about the expectations, people have really fear of those recommendations. Are you going to give away everything that the university owns? Are you going to do enough? And we heard that so much. And again, you don't quite know where you're going because it is an intellectual inquiry. You don't know where you're going to end up, but people are anticipating the worst on either end of that. There were fears of having an open discussion, and I think we hear that a lot. I hear that a lot on my campus now, and I'm in an HBCU. Oh God, if you talk about that, the sky's gonna fall. And so people were just like, let's just not say anything about it. You can't do that, right? Then there were threats. So President Simmons got death threats, real, true death threats. People threatened to abandon their support. So there were people who were donors who just felt like if you have this discussion, you'll never get another one of my dimes, right? But you got to say it's bigger than you. And you have to have enough support on the other side. And again, that's why having that corporation behind her was so important. Big problem is focus creep. And I don't mean this in any disrespectful way, but it's like, what about the Alamo? What about everything other than what we're talking about right here, right? So every time you open up the conversation, someone in this open audience, that's community and so forth, is going to have an issue that they think is more important than the one. And you have to continuously bring people back to what you're talking about. You also have to worry about issues from the floor. And my best example of this is at our town hall meeting, the Nation of Islam showed up, as did the white supremacist brotherhood from Boston. They're sitting right in front of us in this room, right? We like, how does this happen? So, So, we were talking, and it's a town hall meeting, so it's a lot about local things. And there's this high school really close to Brown University. It's called Hope High. And in its day, it must have been a very immaculate school. And now it's sort of in a poor area. It's not kept well. So one of the guys from the white supremacist group was like, just like at Hope High School, it used to be best. Now you got all those minorities in there, and they're pissing on the walls, and, it's going on and on, right? So I have become a little bit more refined than I was then, but not much as you all can see. But anyway, I had to respond to that. And it's the first time the Brown Daily Herald decides to tape all of its stuff. So luckily they had to change the tape in between. But, I started out by saying, I'm like 40 years old. I've been black in America for 40 years, and I've never peed on a wall. That's what they quote in the paper the next day. Associate Provost Allen said, and my point I was trying to make is it was so important that's why those kind of conversations were so important, because we are so segregated. We don't know anything about each other. So we have these visceral reactions based upon these stereotypes that we have. And yes, now I'm 50-something years old and things are happening. But, you know, so just wanted to get to the point where, you know, it's so important to be in conversation with one another, because if you don't, you just talk out of ignorance is the point I wanted to make. But the point that got in the paper is, you know, she said she's 40-something in America and she's not peeing on a wall. But, you know, so all my friends, it's like, you not been to a frat party? Oh, I haven't. So again, you never know. So if you have an open conversation and you invite all these people, then you never know who's going to be sitting in front of you. And so you got to be prepared. And so again, just knowing why you're there, that your charge is clear, that how you're engaging is clear, what's important is clear. You just have to continuously bring people back to the thing that's important. And just sort of just keep people focused, because if not, you can go in so many directions, because, you know, these questions are important, not just for African Americans. You know, they're important for us as a country and as a nation. And, you know, we should say, you know, whether you came over here 400 years ago on a boat or you flew in yesterday on a 747, as a nation, we have to come to grips with our understanding of race. It is in the fabric of this country. It still serves to divide us, even if it does so in a less overt way than it did before. And until we talk about it, anyone who's different is going to be subjected to that. And the last thing we wanted to do was to have all these groups pitted against one another. And so it's about slavery that happened to be connected to African Americans in particular, but a part of the conversation is, how does this then undermine us as a united country today, with other kinds of diversity being a part of that story as well. So being really clear. Post-process, some stuff still. So you always have to worry about sustained effort or lack thereof. So I was reading something from the Brown Alumni Magazine, published in 2012. So I left in 2009. James Campbell went to Stanford like maybe 2009. President Simmons ended her tenure there 2011. So you still have people around, but not people really on top of this. So Evelyn Hudahart, who is a faculty member there, has quoted in his paper saying, "It's a living document, but it's dead." There were so many things in the recommendation about how important that exploration had been, how eye-opening it had been, and how much it should be a part of the history and the orientation of students to Brown. So there was this recommendation that every in-class student doing orientation read it. It's long, and that's Ruth's answer. It's too long. Nobody wants to read it. It's 80-something pages, right? And in my first couple of years there, after we did something in orientation around the report, but that seems to not be is not being done. I was told today that they actually erected a new seminar around these issues to try to weave it back in, so someone's trying to pay attention. So you got to worry about whether or not you put all this effort in and you can sustain it. Another issue is resources to pursue the recommendations. The recommendations in the Brown report are very bold. You know, an urban education program so that we can train teachers who want to go teach in urban schools, and it comes with full fellowships for people, a center for the study of slavery and justice with postdocs and visiting scholars, a memorial, a fund for the children of Providence, because it has some of the worst school systems in Rhode Island. So there was a lot of things in there that had resources. And remember, 2008 hit everyone hard. So it hit the Brown endowment hard. And even though Ruth was able to achieve her campaign goal of raising $2.1 billion for the endowment, when you look at the endeavors at Brown, that's really nothing compared to everything else they wanted to do. So there's been some competition for those resources. But I'm happy to go back and search, and many of the big things have and are still being addressed. There's also things that have to do with implementation of the recommendations. So there's a really bold and outlined recommendation that says there needs to be an oversight committee to oversee the recommendations. And I don't know if they ever appointed that. I was on the post committee that looked at memorials, and there was a post committee that looked at creating the center, but I don't think the oversight committee was there. And so there were lots of issues that came with the implementation when no one's watching, the hen house, I guess, if that's the right metaphor. And so, again, I'm happy to say that many things have been done. So up in the corner, they did finally find someone that the faculty could agree upon to be the director of the Center for Slavery and Justice. That was the biggest holdup. They couldn't get anyone that everybody agreed was the right person. They ended up with Tony Bogues, who was already a professor in Africana Studies. They tried to bring in different people. They tried to really recruit a woman to head that center. Couldn't get her through any department. And I'm happy to say my subcommittee that studied memorials, eventually it went to the city and the state. The memorial was commissioned, and it sits on the green at Brown. It could have been anywhere in the city, but they decided to have it on the campus at Brown. The brilliant thing that Ruth did with that, I think, is that once we went out and looked at different ways that people were memorializing and having memory, she then handed over that report to the Public Arts Council that we had as a university already. So you put it in a governance system that already exists. And so it was their job, the public arts people, to reach out then to the city and see this project through. And they did it, and they actually, I think, did a beautiful job of doing that. And the urban fellows are in the schools teaching. So many of the things are happening, albeit more slowly than people want. But the biggest concern is that the report itself is not accessed as frequently as the committee thinks it should be. And I guess you would if you think you wrote the major piece of work. So I wanted to, and I don't even know where my time is, but they asked a question about HBCUs and the question of slavery and justice. And I had to say, I'm looking at Frederick. Letitia changed my slide because I had HBCUs in North Carolina, because to me it's a different story all over. And so what I have here is just a series of thoughts that I had as I thought through this. So, I think many people will agree that we created HBCUs in many instances to create newly freed slaves. So we understood the connection between those institutions and slavery when they were founded, and that's a given. We also know that the data still shows us that even though the percentage of African Americans who choose to attend an HBCU is decreasing since the signing of affirmative action in 1965, HBCUs still produce a greater proportion of African Americans who graduate college and those who go on to professional and graduate school and to take leadership jobs. And so they are still doing the bulk of the education of African Americans who go on to higher levels of education. We also know, though, that there is, and has been for the last 50 years, a relevancy argument. So are black colleges still relevant? I know when I first got here and started doing some work at Winston-Salem State and thinking about liberal arts and the importance of HBCUs, my then chancellor, Donald Reeves, drove me down to Chapel Hill so I could talk to Erskine Bowles. At that point, he was still the system president, and told my little story. I went to my HBCU. Look how great I am. We still need HBCUs, right? So he, his question, are there still people like you? Absolutely. Worse off than me, So the idea that what I needed when I went off to college in the late 70s is something that's no longer important. I'm first generation college. I grew up in a working class family. My parents worked and struggled. I was halfway smart in school, but my HBCU made me. You know, it was the place that developed and molded me. And I know that, and I give it full credit for that today. And I know that there are individuals who are still like me where it can be such an empowering place. And I come to that position having spent 15 years at a women's college. In the 60s, when they first opened up access to women, the women's colleges that have survived and are strong today, they redefined themselves at that moment. You know, they defined why what they were value added. They created a mission that was about single-sex education and about women, and they are thriving. So your Wellesleys and your Smiths and Barnards and Bryn Mawrs, you know, they're still going strong. We didn't do that at HBCU. So we're sort of 50 years behind defining why we are still relevant. And so people are still asking us that question. And they're asking us that question because they don't believe that we are still relevant in the way that we were when we were segregated. But we know, as we have come to understand, that the narrative of racial injustice and the underdevelopment and the under-resourcing of education, public education especially, that particularly serves certain communities, has not gone away with any of the civil rights movement. That those things still exist, and exist to some degree in a stronger sort of way than they did almost 50 years ago, right? And so we know that there's a continuing need. So question for me is, though, how do we become more courageous as leaders in this discourse? We don't talk about it. So again, I mean, I'm on a campus where people still point to their inside or the outside of their hand rather than say white or black. I'm like, what's that? You know, because that's not a conversation I had. I'm sorry, I don't mean to be funny, but it's just like, what is that? But I realize, coming from where I come from, coming from the institutions where I come from, coming out of a process of looking at slavery and justice where that's all we talked about, to a campus where you have to whisper the word race. And if you dare say that, you're accused of being a racist yourself. So I've been sued so many times by so many people from all across. I don't like white people, I don't like black, I don't like anybody if you were to ask them, because everything's steeped in this whole idea that I can't talk about race without somehow being biased by race. When in fact, to me, if we don't talk about it, we can't understand what's going on. So if you come on my campus, it is so much stuff going on underneath. We have a great deal of diversity, especially among our faculty, but we can't thrive because everyone's afraid to put in front what that strength is, because we can't talk about it. So I don't know what a slavery and justice agenda would look like on my campus. I think we first have to be comfortable understanding that there was a history embedded in race, that we grew out of that history, and that there's still a need for that. I know that in North Carolina we've done some things around eugenics, and some of our representatives in our own area were the leaders in doing that. But at the same time, we have a campus and we have a system. I got here in 2009. In 2009, as a system, they were just addressing a policy for religious holidays. And I was like, a policy for religious holidays? Like, so no one had agreed in the system whether or not Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur or any of those holidays by different cultural groups were important enough to give excuses from classes. And I'm just like, where did I fall into? And I've found that it hasn't gotten a whole lot better, that there's not a comfort level. And so if it's like that at HBCUs, I can't imagine what it's like at a place like Duke. And so my final bit of advice is you gotta, I think you have an extra step of getting a sense of the readiness of people to engage it, because it is a deep discussion. It can be personal, or people find a way to personalize it even if it's not personal. And so we got to make sure that people are ready to engage it. And then once they are, then, like I said, if you keep it in the realm of what we're doing, it's an intellectual inquiry that's going to expand and broaden our understanding so that we can then address it in a collective way, tends to keep people more focused and able to get through the task. So that's the story at Brown. Yes.
You're saying that Winston-Salem is having a real hard time even beginning this conversation?
We don't even have a conversation about this piece of it. And so, for example, when I got in, having been a chief diversity officer, one of my first observations and my greatest concerns was that our faculty in particular are divided in terms of their ideas around who belongs. So you're a historically black college, you have African American faculty members, you have Caucasian faculty members, you have foreign nationals, and everyone's afraid that somebody believes that they don't belong there. So for me, coming from where I come from, that's a huge diversity issue. And so I actually tried to raise it and have some conversations about it, and you get total shutdown. And so I'm a psychologist. I've been trying to read, what is going on? Because everything that I know about best practices for starting this just doesn't work on my campus. And so a lot of it is that we haven't addressed the history. We haven't confronted a whole lot of things. We talk gloriously about the students from A&T that integrated the Woolworths, or the students from Winston-Salem State and Wake Forest that integrated the Woolworths there, and we're all champions about that from a historical standpoint, but how that has and has not affected us as a campus, how that relates to how we are positioned in a system, are things that we just don't talk about on campus, and we don't talk about them at the system level either. I'm looking at you, we all want to keep our jobs, right? But to me, that's just the reality. And so to me, you can't confront reality. You can't engage history unless you confront reality. And we just haven't confronted reality. Yes?
I was wondering if you can comment a little bit more about the idea that only a person of a specific background can consider appropriately and accurately issues that relate to that background. So in this case, John Campbell, you mentioned he got a lot of critiques for being the person who was heading this committee because he's a white male. Can you comment a little bit more about that dynamic?
Okay, so my thing is that it's not a limitation, but that's a limitation in how we think, right? So we often think if the subject matter doesn't include who we are, that we cannot become an expert on it. Again, that's a reality. Just a reality in the way that we think, which again, I think has to do with a lot of the ways in which we've been disconnected as people. And so, we believe, for example, that if you are African American, you must be an expert on African Americans. I mean, to teach Afro-Am at Smith, and I had a mother call when a daughter wants to major in Afro-Am, and she's been black her whole life, what can you teach her, right? So, that there's no expertise there. Being an African-American woman doesn't make me an expert on African-American women. I might have a perspective that's a lived one, but I'm not the expert to run a panel on women, black women in academia. I might contribute, but it's not my research area. I have spent no time dwelling in it. So people come with that limited view, and the point I wanted to make, though, was that didn't deter President Simmons from her choice. Her choice was about the person who was the scholar, who could bring the most basic understanding of what it was we were trying to do, and that was Jim Campbell, and so she stood behind it. But that didn't mean that we didn't have to manage that over the first few months of the committee, because there were people who were really salty about that. And so it had to be managed. And so he had to be legitimized. Although he should not have been, he had to, you know. And so recognizing that we had to do that instead of saying, get over it, is the point. You know, you just got to deal with what people's prejudices are. Yes.
Eileen. Yeah. Oh, hi. Thank you so much. I really learned a lot, and I had two questions. One was, I really loved your point about archives and how everything is here and present. And I think that was true. That's probably was true at Brown. Is probably true here too. But as you know from a state university or something, that in fact one of the dangers is destroyed archives or hidden histories. Like North Carolina is actually a great example of all sorts of state medical experiments, you know, things that are in fact not visible or actively hidden. And I was just wondering how, you know, to approach something like that as a kind of starting point. But that was my first question. My second question is probably more about pragmatics. Is in this this process at Brown, at what point did you get alumni involved? Like, you know, when do alumni's voices matter and can be a positive, you know, instead of just people saying, I'm not giving you a dime again, but when do, you know, sort of positive, strong voices from alumni actually help the cause of something like this?
So I think in answering the first question, everything's hidden in plain sight. And so, you know, the greatest thing about digging through the archives is that you don't even know what's in there. But if you go in with some basic perspective on things you're interested in, you never know what you uncover. Like one of the things we uncovered was this hanging in the museum, a painting. And it shows all these generals, including our own, somewhere in the Caribbean, you know, drinking it up with a whole bunch of enslaved African people, serving them, hanging in one of their halls forever. And so it sort of tells a story because someone connected to Brown commissioned that painting from that visit. So it's like detective, right? But that's what researchers are, right? We're detectives. We dig, we look, we try to make connections. And so part of it is that it's only hidden because we haven't looked for it. But there's always something that's going to lead you to something else, and you have to be motivated to start digging. In terms of alumni, first thing is lots of people on the Brown Corporation are alums. So that's the first place of engagement. Second is that many of the folk who we brought in to do some of the presentations were alums who are doing some of this work. So that's a connection with their group. But also I staffed an advisory board that consisted of alums. And so, you know, one of the things I did as a part of that advisory board was to keep them updated. And they were connected to the National Black Alumni Association of Brown. So we tried to make sure in the same way that we did commencement forum for parents and graduates and so on, that we did the same things to keep the alumni engaged. And when we could find alumni who were engaged in topics that were connected to this, we made sure that we highlighted them in our programming. Yes?
What was the selection process like for people inside the committee? Because you had mentioned that there are people who disagreed that slavery was a crime to humanity, and that actually, you know, came with a lot of barriers later on as you're trying to do the work of the committee. So, you know, what was the process of selection, and, you know, did you wish it had gone a different way?
So the committee was selected before I got there, but hindsight, when I started to look at who's on there, they were selected for who they were as scholars. So we had people who were Holocaust scholars, people who studied retrospective justice and some other kind of thing, philosophers who talked about moral reasoning, historians who studied either African American history or American history or transatlantic slave history. People were mostly selected because of their disciplinary area and their area of research. And then, as any good committee would do, you also go across and try to look to see if there's diversity with regard to race and gender once you make that selection. And so the reason for the people to be in there was absolutely right, given the task. The task was an intellectual task that was going to be broad and diverse in disciplines and so on. But that couldn't control what people believed, to be important about the process. And so to me, there were two things that you had to come to grips on to end up with a report such as the one we wrote. You could have come to different conclusions and your report would have looked different, right? So the two things for us was, is there a legacy that manifests itself today? And if we agreed upon that, then we would be able to make recommendations that said we have to think about how that's manifesting today. And can we call this actual thing a crime against humanity? Because that also then says something very strongly about what that process did to people. And so one of the things that we understand about things that are deemed crimes against humanity is that the very action was designed to dehumanize who they are. And when you take away a person's humanness, their culture, their action as people, you relegate them as something less than human. And if you don't think you're really harming human beings, then how that carries forward historically will have very different meaning. Yes.
Did you ever feel like you spent a lot of time and emotional labor just appealing to the moral consciousness of people? I mean, that must have been frustrating.
So frustrating, yeah. But I'm gonna go back to a statement I made in the beginning, and I stand by that. And that is, in terms of what I learned intellectually about just the vast set of complex issues that converge on this topic, have been so enlightening for me as an intellectual. But my greatest gift was the personal growth that I had about it. I had a very narrow opinion even about that legacy, right? And so even though I may have been on one side of that coin, I was very extreme. Nothing had to be that extreme. That's what I came to understand. The other thing I came to understand as a person is that once we looked at Brown's history, it's not as bad as people thought. Most people's history is not. It's a part of an American story. And it allows you to put the whole thing in a different context. And so as an educator, I believe it takes that kind of tension and that kind of discomfort to grow. And so, while it's frustrating going through it, if you look at it for what it can do for you in terms of your own intellectual development and growth, then it's worth living through. And that's how I feel about every bit of what I had to do on this committee to help manage it to move forward and to deal with my own frustrations and my own blocks, because I had biases too that were keeping us from coming to a common ground, and we were able to get there in the end, and I think write a report that honored what our charge was. But frustrating, yes, I get it. Yes.
My question here is, as you well know, there's a school of thought that says, the effects of slavery aren't over, right? I mean, they're continuing to compound, and that debt that we have is continuing to compound. Do you think the one-time process that you all undertook, the one-time sit-down, the things that you all did over that course of the 5 to 8 years, do you think that adequately accounted for the compounding problem that we have today? Or do you think that there's still more that needs to be done to adjust for the fluid problem that exists?
Well, I think that there's more that needs to be done, absolutely. But I think that more means that it can't be one institution looking at its own history. All it can do is address its history and try to figure out what it can do today to atone for that, or to recognize it and make some contributions for any part it may have played in where certain people in Providence are today. And it did that for Providence. But that's only Providence, and that's only a piece of what needs to be dealt with. You know, Bill Clinton, right, tried to have this national conversation about race, and it wasn't sustained. So we've tried over time to engage it, and one of the things that I came to understand as a part of this process is just how deeply personal this is for almost everyone. It's personal if you are a descendant of those who were enslaved. It's personal if you are thought to be a descendant of those who enslaved. You don't have to be, right? It's personal for people who today are catching hell for a whole nother reason that's probably somehow connected to that. And I think it just all comes back to the fact that we won't, as a nation, really confront this racial history. I think Brown did a lot to put some real teeth around how we need to define it. There's all kind of areas of scholarship. As a psychologist, I study the relationship between culture and learning, and I look at retentions, West African retentions and some of cultural behaviors in especially working class Black communities, how they manifest and how you might be able to use them in school settings to increase learning. You know, what you're up against though is that everything that might even be a retention or related to that is seen as negative. So there's this whole myth of Black inferiority that has carried forward from the whole start where African people were seen as less than human beings. If you start out with that as your narrative, and you never get to be a whole human, you know, so even with emancipation, you didn't get to be a whole human. Nothing humanized African American people to the extent that it needs to, so that they're not seen as other. And how that is embedded in our racial history as a society, how that's embedded in, you know, what mainstream culture is designed to do. And if you look at things about African Americans, it's everything that's sort of antithetical to being white and middle class. I mean, that's the way the history and the research has gone on for time, and we won't address it. And the reason why is it starts out with, you know, we often define who we are by who we are not. And so a lot of how we define ourselves as being American is by not being Black, whatever that means, right? That's important, you know, that's huge. And then anybody who comes after that is only going to be as American as they are in relation to what ideal American is. And so we look at how minority groups are embraced or not embraced, it's the degrees to which you deviate from what ideal is. That starts in a racial narrative that we have never confronted. And until we do, we're just going to be playing around the edges. So Brown may have made life better for itself for a little while, and now they have some things to show for that. And there are people who want to continue to move this, so there's a conscience that's still there. So it'll continue to affect that institution, but it's no longer a national conversation. It ceased to be a national conversation when the report was released, pretty much. You know, different schools are raising it, but they still don't get as much press or play as it did, because I just think as a nation, we are just not ready to grapple with it. And sad to say, being a resident of North Carolina for the last 7.5 years, we are way behind even starting to have this conversation, even on a historically Black college campus. And so it's just a lot of work to do. But I'm gonna look back at you and say, but I'm not frustrated, I'm energized. Because you gotta do it. Who else is gonna do it, right? Who else is gonna engage it? And there's no one right or wrong, right? It's the opportunity to engage that, because what's truth and what's good is probably somewhere in the middle. So, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.